So with that, I'd like to introduce the group today. These are our first exit advisors that are going to work with us, and they're going to be available. And the idea is that we're going to have these exit advisors on call, on demand, for our portfolio companies that have been funded through Keiretsu Capital, so that we can help the companies get to an exit faster. So with that, Steve, you want to take it away first?
Absolutely, Mike. And by the way, kudos to Keiretsu and the Keiretsu Cap Fund for identifying exit as its own specific process. I think the consequence of pulling this team together, and as you're about to hear, this team has really fabulous credentials. The investments that you've made in the K-Cap Fund are going to wind up being just more bountiful at the end, having done this pre-work. Anyway, I'm Steve Kirshner. A lot of people call me Steve K, and I'm a marketing guy, background in Madison Avenue, brand management. I've been a chief marketing officer half a dozen times. And think of the last time you were at a car dealership, one with acres of cars. Invariably, there's a kid out among the cars with a soft cloth, and he's shining up the cars. And that's because the dealership wants to sell the sizzle and not sell the steak. I did the same thing with companies. I worked with them between 1 and 2 years ahead of their exit event, and I try to identify what's unique in that company within the industry, and then broadcast and amplify that. So when they go to market, this company is not only well known, but this company is recognized as being unique. It's a process I call exit value amplification. And using this process, I've been able to increase exit values anywhere between 20 and 50% or more. I was able to increase the exit of my own software company 34% by doing exactly this. What I do is I work with CEOs, and we put together a specific plan for the exit. We work on a specific set of talking points. What will wind up happening is I will work through right up to the exit event, sometimes actually into the exit event. This has very consistently produced better results as a product of working with these companies. Lowell?
Thanks, Stephen. Lowell Rickliffs, and my background, I was a nerd in middle school. I was a programmer, computer science early on. Electrical engineer. I worked for a startup in college. I got involved on the sales side. I worked for Rockwell, Fortune 500 for 15 years. My last two roles, global vice president of sales for a $3 billion group, heavily involved in the acquisition strategy, so I know how things work at the Fortune 500 level. My last 3 years, I actually managed a software business, wholly owned subsidiary, for 3 years. Then I was a part of 3 different startups, so online market research, data collection. I was the chief revenue officer. We spun the first one up from $1 million to $50 million. It was sold to WPP, went to work for a competitor based in Europe. As their COO, we built that from $10 million to $120 million. That was sold to a private equity firm. Actually, it was a family office, Belgian, the InBev family. And after that, co-founded a company here in Seattle, industry leader, healthcare IT, and that was sold to a company in Chicago called Jellyvision. So with all 4 companies, I was involved in the acquisition strategy, the due diligence, and the integration of the companies. Along the way, I actually sold my own company most recently, combined my knowledge of the buying process with my sales background. Successfully ran the process, ran it again for another investor, and it opened up Traction M&A 2 years ago to leverage my knowledge and experience building companies to help companies, primarily in the Pacific Northwest, enterprise value between 5 and 50 million to find the right buyer and get the most value. So, thanks, Mike.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. And Mike, thanks very much for the invitation to come here today. I'm a long-term Keiretsu Forum member since 2005, and I'm always impressed at what a great job Keiretsu does and help people make great investments. But we always talk about how making great investments is just a means to an end, and the end is great exits. The means is great investments. So I'm happy to be here talking about this today. I am the managing director of Sikich Investment Banking, which is a Chicago-based firm, but works throughout the United States. I'm based here in Seattle. I've been an investment banker helping companies sell when the time is right for about 10 years. prior to that, I was Vice President of Business Development for Motorola Corporation. And in that role, I also worked with Motorola Ventures and in corporate development on the buy side. So now when I'm selling companies to major strategic corporations, I have the benefit of knowing how they think because I've been on their side of the table. So thank you, and I'm looking forward to a good discussion today.
Thank you for having me. Steve and I were actually just speaking about how this particular branch of Keiretsu does a fantastic job of recognizing the value and importance of intellectual property. For me, I'm a patent strategist. A patent strategist works at the intersection of intellectual property law, business development, and technology. And as part of the role, I really focus on 3 areas as it relates to intellectual property in this intersection. The first is determining should we file, period. And if we do file, how do we evaluate the appropriate ROI for having made the investment in intellectual property? The second area that a patent strategist will focus on is how do we develop the patent portfolio to ensure that as the business grows and evolves, the needs of that business are actually being met by the intellectual property. And lastly, I get involved as a patent strategist in the actual commercialization of the intellectual property, leveraging IP and business transactions to resolve the needs of the business. Along those lines, I've been in IP for 15 years. I've been recognized by IAM as one of the top 300 patent strategists in the world. I've raised 115 million in capital and closed about 60 million in pure patent transactions.
So when you grow up now, then what do you want to do? No.
Interpretive dance.
So, okay, thanks guys. So I've had really great conversations with all these guys. They're great to go out and have coffee with, but what we're trying to do is put together this workbook, and you guys all have a copy of this. And I'll just ask you to turn to page 16 in that workbook and kind of show you what the framework is that we're working through. We're trying to ask CEOs to start thinking about this exit process early, and we hope that this workbook is going to become a tool for Keiretsu Capital as a reporting tool, so the CEOs can come back to us and go, this is where I'm at on my exit plan, this is what I'm working on next, so that we have some ideas for when these milestones might come up. So the CEOs, a lot of times, when I've talked to them, they'll say, when should I sell the company? And Joe, I'm going to have to start off with you because you've been through this a lot with people coming to you, and I'm sure they're going, hey, I'm ready to sell, but there's some event that triggered that. But when should they think about selling?
So let me just address this first by saying that, to me, that's the most important question in the entire process, which is when really managing the timing of when to sell the company. If you have great timing but a mediocre company, you might have a successful process. But if you have a poor company and the industry is really booming, you might be able to be successful then, or the converse. So an example that I know from when I lived in Florida before I moved here was a man named Wayne Huizenga. Does anybody know that name? He's very smart because he made $1 billion in garbage collection, waste management, and in 1987 he bought a little company called Blockbuster Video for $18.5 million and professionalized it. He put in a couple of $100 million. But then at the height of video rental in 1994, he sold it to Viacom for $8.4 billion. Now he was smart enough to realize that there was something called the internet that was coming along, which included streaming data and even streaming video. So his timing was perfect, and it was worth several $1 billion. Now, what happened to Blockbuster? 2010, it filed for bankruptcy and was bought out of bankruptcy for very little. So in regards to timing, there's really 4 levels. One is the overall economy. Is it booming now, or do we think maybe the bust is about to come? We all remember dot-com bust in 2000. We remember the 2009 crash. And so that's the first layer. The second one is what's going on in our industry. Are we selling a product that's about to go become obsolete, or is this really taking off? The third layer is the company itself. You always want to be selling on an uptick if you can, and if you can put all that together, you can get the highest value. But there's also situations where you see trouble coming for the company, whether it's IP or something else, and you might want to say, now's a good time to get out. So there's sort of offensive and defensive reasons for selling a company. And the last layer is really the position of the shareholders. I work with some venture capital firms that have companies, maybe they put 30 million into it. They hope to sell it for 400 million, but things aren't working. They see this maybe going bankrupt eventually. They'd like to sell it now and get 30 million out. So I guess the key takeaways are timing is really, really important, and analyze that carefully first before you decide to run a process.
Awesome. So Lowell, I had coffee with you and we talked a lot about this window of speaking of the timing that Joe's talking about, that a lot of times it's not really the important, is where the company is in timing, it's the timing of the acquirer, the buyer. It's what window they're in, right? And you've been on that side of things a lot. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So on the buyer side, there are multiple reasons, I break it down. There's proactive and there's opportunistic. So there are reasons on the buy side. Every company, most companies I know, 95% are struggling to hit the numbers that they'd like to hit. Every company could use more growth. So top line and EBITDA growth. So they're constantly looking, if it's a European company and they want to expand into the U.S., an acquisition is a logical place to go, or into Asia, or Asia into the U.S. So geographic expansion. If you're focused on manufacturing in the plant floor and you've got 5,000 customers and it's hard to expand market share, there might be adjacent products that you could sell, your existing channel could sell to your existing clients. So it's fairly easy. There's a lot of logic behind it. There might be competitors that are doing a better job than you are in a certain area, and you just can't beat them, so you take them out. You pick up the money. Sometimes there are efficiencies of scale. You simply take out a company that does the same thing that you do in the same geography for economies of scale. It's pretty common.
So did you find, if you don't mind, did you
Yep.
find that a lot of times you went out searching for these companies to acquire, or did they come to you and say, did they try to strike up a relationship with you, or did you just find them?
My experience has been a mix of both. But as a part of our strategy, when we were pretty aggressively growing, I would do the research to. I had my corp dev hat on to identify companies that were the right fit, and then the right company in the right fit. The other side is more opportunistic. So companies decide that they want to be bought. They'll run a process. They'll hire a banker who will approach us, and they may not have been on our radar, but it's interesting, and we would often take a look at it, and we may not want a competitor to pick it up, so it might be defensive as much as offensive. But yeah, I'd say 50% of the time, a part of my job was to keep an eye out for where the logical acquisition candidates would be, which is kind of you touched on it earlier. Most CEOs don't spend enough time really thinking about who's going to buy them. They'll do a little bit of research to find 5 comps, so when they're raising money, they can say these 5 companies will buy us. But they haven't really thought about what it takes to be bought. I can spend a lot of time talking about that. But they should reach out, talk to the CEO, just get to know them so it's a database. Try to do business with the people that might buy you. It's like getting married. I mean, if someone is dating early on, if they're doing business with you and they can give a good recommendation of your company, they're not starting from scratch when it's cold.
So this kind of leads to you, Steve, because this is one of the reasons I brought Steve up, because you've helped a lot of these companies sort of package themselves. So the part that you're in, your philosophy is in packaging and marketing these companies the right way from the beginning, sort of gets them on the radar of the buyers faster, right? And starts that relationship sooner. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely right. Well, marketing planning and exit planning are actually almost flip sides of the same coin. Any good organization who wants to exit should be doing marketing planning the same way a CFO does budgeting, a chief marketing officer does marketing planning. If you're a chief financial officer, you would never think about not doing a budget. A chief marketing officer would never think about not doing a marketing plan. And what marketing plans do is they put you on the path to growing your business every year. They take a look at your market share. Where is our market share today? Where do we want to grow it to? What market segments do we want to go after? How does public relations fit into this overall plan? And how can we build up and burnish our brand to make it strong and not only present in our marketplace, but make it seem like it's dominant in the marketplace? Remember, perception is reality in so many parts of business and so many parts of life. Same thing is true for exits. if your brand and your company is perceived as being dominant in your marketplace, when you go to exit the company, either people coming to you, or you hire an investment bank and you want to exit at that point, if you are very present and perceived as dominant in your marketplace, you'll get a premium for your sale.
You were a participant in a technology company years ago, right? And
Yes.
you had an exit, and you exercised some of this stuff. That's kind of where you learned it, right? Because at the time, your company wasn't the dominant one in the market, right? But you did a lot of things to sort of burnish the image, and that paid off at the exit.
That's exactly right, Mike. We had a software company, started in 1989. We were fourth to market in our industry, but we wound up, when we sold the company in 1997, we participated in 7 market segments, and we were not only dominant in 6 of them, we were hyper-dominant. Our exit market shares were between 68 and 92% using the techniques that I've been talking about. But in particular, we used a lot of public relations every single year. And one of the things we did that I find a lot of companies don't bother to do is either they're not doing PR, or when they do PR, they don't keep track of it. So we were in our exit negotiations, and we had an offer on the table from our acquirer of $17 million. But our acquirer was from Sweden, and they knew we were dominant in our industry. They knew we had the generic in our industry, but they didn't know how well we were known. So part of what we did is we presented them with 2 3-inch 3-ring binders that were loaded with articles, hundreds of articles about us. And that, contributing to part of the negotiation, increased our exit price from $17 million to $23 million. And so, that was a really good return on all those color copies.
Yeah, that color copier is going crazy. So, Matthew, I got to ask you. One of the things that's come up with CEOs that I've talked to a lot is IP. Everybody thinks their IP is worth a fortune. In fact, I think I just talked to somebody a couple of months ago that I brought to you that the company went bankrupt, but the CEO said, no problem, we can sell this IP easy for $6 million. You've always said that IP is really important at the beginning and really important at the end. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So with respect to intellectual property, there's been several journal articles that have been published by MIT, Harvard Business Journal, the United States Patent and Trademark Office. And what we find in the early stage, raising a Series A, for example, an issued patent for a company raising capital, on average is worth $530,000. And when we look at companies that are raising a Series A at a $2 million pre-money valuation, that patent is contributing 25% of the value of that company. So very early on, a company is in desperate need, right, of cash. So you either raise that through capital sell or through business transactions. And what I've consistently found in my career is that when you want to engage customers, particularly large customers that could really make or break or change the trajectory of your business, having IP can dramatically change that. And then on the sell side, when you actually get ready to exit, properly packaging your IP can similarly, much like in a capital raise, juice the valuation of your portfolio. It also opens up very creative ways of doing exits outside of, say, an IPO or a traditional merger and acquisition. When you have IP, you have the ability, the beauty of it is that you can sell it multiple times. And so you can engage in transactions and sell your technology in multiple verticals and get multiple bites at the apple in terms of diversifying your ability to actually exit.
Joe, how do you engage the IP stuff when companies come to you?
Well, in the area of technology, which is most of the companies I work in, manufacturing not so much, the IP is really important, particularly in regards to clear ownership of valuable technology. One of my early clients did not disclose early on to the prospective buyer that they did not actually own the technology that was the core of their business, but rather they licensed it from somebody else. So clear ownership of IP is important, and if there's any problems around it, it's good to disclose that right away, because it can be considered bad faith and damage the trust that's necessary if it's not disclosed properly early on in the process.
So in this process, what kind of things should the CEO be doing ahead of time before the exit comes up about IP?
Well, I'll call that IP and contracts in general. I mean, certainly clear ownership of the IP is important. Employment agreements, I've seen a lot of companies where they had, during the early days of the company, they had a friend of theirs help them develop some of the design software for the company, and then he left, but there's sort of uncertainty about who really owns it. There's sort of a handshake agreement, but it's good to have everything really nailed down. Some very obscure things can cause problems in a process. There was one I was involved in where they owned a building in Pioneer Square, and there was some report from 1892 that there was a chemical plant there at that time, and they had to prove that there weren't any toxic chemicals in the ground. So it really almost killed the sale. So it's just really important to go through every single legal contract and make sure they're all buttoned down really before you start the process, not during the process.
Well, when an acquirer finds one of these young companies, obviously IP is a lot of times at the heart of why you're buying that company, right? But I'm curious as to what is going on in that other conference room. You know, there's what's going on in this conference room where we think we know what you're after and what you're saying, and we're going to present this in the right way, but we don't really know what's going on in the buyer's conference room and how you're looking at what that discussion.
Yeah. What's like raising money with a VC, both a Fortune 500 company and a mid-sized company? A couple of things have to happen. Typically, there's someone who's a sponsor, an individual that stakes their career or their reputation on the fact that this would be a good deal. So they believe somehow through the cost savings, through the revenue growth over time, it's a strategic fit for the company. So they've got their own sales job to do internally. And at some point, if that's not the CEO will have to put their neck on the line. They've got a board. They may have private equity investors or public investors. So their credibility is on the line. So internally, there's a lot of internal selling that has to go on. There's certainly a lot of alignment of the P&Ls. They'll align at the P&Ls. They'll look for cost savings, synergy. Someone will have to put together a business case that outlines over the next 3 to 5 years what the projected revenue and contribution margin would be from this acquisition. Then on the risk side, the attorneys will want to do diligence and make sure that they're not taking on some liabilities. So they'll go through pretty thoroughly. That usually someone on the technology side will want to do a technical analysis. Do they believe that this is something unique and special?
So what usually kicks the candidate out right away? What in your experience when you're looking at these companies and you're in that mode, you've got a staff of people that are combing through these things.
Yeah.
What's kicking these companies out? Because all of the people that I've talked to think, well, for sure they're going to want to buy us. I mean, Why wouldn't they? That's what they always say. Why wouldn't they buy us? You know.
You can usually get a fair amount of interest on the first round where people will talk. It just depends. Sometimes there may be a perfect fit, but the acquirer just did a massive acquisition. They just ingested $1 billion company. So everything is on hold for 2 or 3 years. I went through one recently. We had an LOI. We were 9 days away from signing the purchase agreement, and the company that was going to do the acquisition was acquired. And the 3 of the 4 sponsors, the SVP of product, the CFO, and general counsel, were all removed from their roles, and new people were inserted. So the process was started over. So a lot of different things can happen. Back to the IP. There are things that not having early agreements in place at the 11th hour can be a surprise. I think one of the things that can be a real problem is on the integrity side. If commitments are made in the PowerPoint that when you start to do due diligence, the numbers don't reflect what was in the PowerPoint. It's like the layers of an onion. If you peel back the first layer and you find out there were some mistruths, that there's one thing to focus on the positive news. I mean, that's normal. It's another thing to, I'll say, fabricate numbers that just are patently false and off by quite a bit. At that point, you pretty much know as you peel back the onion, you're going to find more and more problems, and the deal's done. And had they just been honest about the numbers, and the price might have been reduced, they may buy the company anyway. So being honest about what you've got, it's okay to focus on the positive. Is good. But it can be personality conflicts. It can be region. There was a company in San Francisco, perfect fit, culture, price, everything was a good fit. At the last minute, European company said, we'll come to the conclusion we don't want to do any acquisitions in San Francisco. It's too expensive. We're going to focus on Vancouver, BC, because it's 40% of the cost. So, yeah, but culture, geography, and fit. Yeah.
Steve, you've probably seen Joe, do you have a
Yeah, let
comment
me just
about that?
add one quick thing to what Lowell said, and that is momentum and timing. Companies, just like people, have short attention spans sometime and shiny object syndrome. And the longer the deal drags out, the more ways there is for the deal not to be completed. I mean, there's even things like the sponsor at the acquiring company leaves the company. So, the more time that goes by, priorities can change, management can change, financial situations can change. So once the deal gets going, it's very important to keep that momentum going. Now that's difficult. You have things like lawyer management, to make sure that things don't drag out more than they need to. But keeping the momentum going is really important. Lack of doing that can kill a deal that otherwise should get done.
Steve, I was going to ask you when Lowell was talking about kind of getting to the truth of the matter and the packaging, and when you're encouraging companies to get the word out about themselves and tell the world who they are, what they're about, to increase the value at exit and the chances of exiting, how are they balancing what they're saying and what they're not saying?
Well, Mike, you've heard the expression in Hollywood that all PR is good PR. The opposite is true in M&A. Because you can say the wrong thing publicly and it can literally tank your deal. And one of the things that I've done with my clients is, first of all, we work from talking points. So when we go out to speak to the press or speak to the news media, be it financial press, be it their industry press, we're working from a script. So everybody's on the same sheet of music in terms of what we're saying. We also role play questions that might come up. Let me give you an example of something that happened to me. I was with a client, let's call him Jack Smith, and we were talking to an editor, and the editor says, Jack, and the conversation was going really well. Jack, I really like your products, really like what your company is doing, but your competitor, XYZ Industries, just came out with a product that's going to be a game changer. What do you think of that? And we had rehearsed this, but Jack, being a type A CEO, came out with something to the equivalent of, XYZ sucks! And at which point the conversation became all about Jack Company versus XYZ. And no sooner were we out of the room, but the reporter gets on the phone to the CEO of XYZ and says, Mr. CEO, I was just talking to Jack Smith, and he said, and I quote, XYZ sucks. What do you think of that? And so the article came out to be about my client and XYZ. And, that changes the entire discussion. When you're in front of the press, you really have to learn how to manage the conversation. And in the example I just gave, the way you should deal with that is by redirecting the conversation in a nice way back to yourself. By saying, XYZ has done some really impressive things. But have you heard about the way our new product or our new technology is really going to transform the whole industry? So it's very important, particularly when you're going into an M&A, that you don't do anything that is either going to interfere with the transaction or interfere with the due diligence.
Great. I want to open the discussion up to questions from anybody, too, if anybody has any questions. Oh, sure.
Thank you, gentlemen, for your discussion. I am curious about education. So I've had the great opportunity to go around universities who are teaching entrepreneurship, and no one teaches classes on exit. And so when you have these entrepreneurs that are, heading down this pathway, how important do you actually think it is to talk about the options up front that they have to exit, to be able to keep the ecosystem? Or do you actually think that entrepreneurism cannot be taught, and it's just something that lies within the industry?
Good question. So the question is really, does it happen for a reason, or does it just happen by accident a lot of times, right? Because there is no education about this.
There is no education in universities right now about exit. They feel that it will limit their entrepreneurs and what they are building.
Well, it's funny because when I asked the entrepreneurs one of the questions I asked them was, what do you see? Like, what are your options when it comes to an exit? And they always start off, well, we could be acquired, or we could go IPO, or we get okay. But there are all these other options, right? And but they just haven't thought that through. And I'm doing this research, and I'm trying to think figure out, is there a pattern to this? Like this M&A thing seems to be like sales 101, you know, you just get it out, package it up, get it out there to a lot of people, but it often comes down to relationships, right? Because these entrepreneurs aren't learning about exits. They're sort of just happening, right?
Brianna, I'll just make a quick comment here. That's a really good question, and I've noticed there's a philosophical divide about that question. I'm of the side that says start with the end in mind. When someone comes to me when they're starting up a company that says, I'm going to grow this company and in 4 years I want to sell it to A, B, or C for 150 million, to me that really clarifies and helps them keep on track. I've also talked to investors who say, I don't want my people to be distracted thinking about an exit. I want them to concentrate on building the company. So that's the philosophical divide. I think you can start with the end in mind and do it in a focused way and not be distracted. So.
Yeah, I was going to say, I work with a lot of, I do a lot of mentoring. I work with hundreds of early stage CEOs over the years. Some are interested, some aren't, and kind of the same thing. I would coach them that there are certain things that you should do early on. Have your paperwork in order, so if you're developing the IP, if it's critical, that can be a real problem later on. That can be incredibly stressful. So those are basic things that they can do to get their house in order. And they can take some time, like 1 day per month, and think about who might buy the company and what you should do to try to get in front of those companies. So, because I do think it can be dangerous if all you're thinking about is an exit and how you'll get there. You want to focus on the business. But you should take some time, and I can walk you through the process. It's good to understand what the process might look like so that you're in the proper position before you get there.
Steve, do you have a comment?
Yes, similarly, starting with the end in mind, I like to have entrepreneurs or the CEO, whoever the lead decision maker or makers are, look at their company through the lens of the M&A and then work backwards from there. And Lowell's right, it's a tricky proposition because you really don't want to have your management and the rest of the staff thinking about this. But the key decision makers and your board of directors, you absolutely want to have them looking at the company through the lens of the M&A, because if they're doing that, they'll make better decisions to focus and push the company in that direction.
Yeah, that's a good question. Because I've actually had people say to me, well, do you want me to build a business or do you want me to work on this exit plan? You know, so, because there's only so many hours in the day and they're all working, you know, like crazy theoretically. So, anybody else? Oh, sure.
Yeah, one of the recent changes in the investment industry is the ability to crowdfund IPO for a significantly greater amount than previously possible without SEC oversight and registration. And, you know, we've talked about cryptocurrencies, and obviously there's a lot of energy around ICOs and the potential to sort of generate capital from this interest and excitement. I'm curious if what level of the crowdfunding IPO, companies could capture. You know, essentially lots of other companies, more traditional companies, might have energy and excitement around it. It would seem a crowdfunding IPO would be a good way to potentially capture that. But yet, it's not really being addressed directly, and a lot of people are still unaware of some of the flexibility in that. Do you have any comment on crowdfunding IPO at this point in time? Is that, as far as we talk about M&A, sales, and other stuff, and then even just a traditional IPO, which obviously is intensive on the registration side and other costs and requirements. Where do you see crowdfunding IPOs and new higher limits up to 50 million fitting into investment strategies?
Matt, you want to talk about that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, when you look specifically at Reg D, right, in the Jobs Act and the ability to actually do crowdfunding, this is something that's fundamentally fantastic. I look at it more along the lines of kind of how you market a company and the new opportunities that you have. So if you are a CEO and you're trying to build and scale your business, rather than going on a roadshow for a year or 2 years, talking to as many VCs as you possibly can, and consistently getting rejected, there's a huge amount of money sitting on the sidelines for these Reg D types of opportunities. You can invest your time into packaging your company to market it, get it in front of more eyeballs, and substantially de-risk the shot that that you won't be successful in the raise. And so there's a handful of organizations that are actually focusing on Reg D capital raises.
The situation is still the same. In that situation, you've got a lot of smaller investors coming in theoretically, right?
Yeah.
So
Potentially, yeah.
they're not asking the same questions that somebody writing a $100,000 or $200,000 check is going to ask, right? So there's even less due diligence on their part, would you say, or?
Well, I mean, you have an advantage with a forum like Keiretsu, right, where you have information that's widely and publicly available. In terms of the diligence that I've seen in crowdfunding types of campaigns, there's just a lot more work that goes into something ahead of time, and it doesn't necessarily have to be that the investors that are engaged in crowdfunding are making smaller contributions. Instead, there are investors that are looking for increased deal flow and are looking for things like equity crowd raises, right, as a way of increasing their deal flow.
Nate, do you see that as a viable option for the portfolio companies we have? Going that, yeah, sure. Oh, thanks.
I mean, we're looking for all.
I mean, from our mind, you know, liquidity is liquidity. It's either going to be zero or we want to return faster. So all options are on the table. You know, as angel investors here, any and all ways that we can explore to get more liquidity faster, you know, we're not going to leave anything on the table. So we do have some very creative strategies. We have some folks like the folks on the panel here have been doing this for 15 or 20 years. They've got some ideas. And so, and that's the one thing with the Keiretsu Global Network, 2,500 members, 54 chapters, and growing. We've got quite a marketplace here to create liquidity, and we're going to do it.
Well, it looks like our time is up, so I'll say, we'll take, anybody else have any questions? One more?
Yeah, if I may, just a follow-on to the question about the IPOs, because our company actually is just beginning the process of a Reg A plus small IPO. The question is does that process increase or decrease the likelihood of an acquisition from a partner? In other words, the fact that a company files with the SEC, if they do so publicly, or actually becomes a publicly traded company, does that enhance or interfere with, in your opinion, the potential of an acquisition from a large company?
Good question. Anybody want to take that one?
I don't know that I'm an expert, but I guess what I've observed, what I would share, I think when you file, you'll attract, there's just a lot of private equity money out there right now today. So I think fewer companies are choosing to go the IPO route for a lot of reasons. It's complicated. It restricts, you know, a lot of what you can do and what you can share. And there's just a lot of private equity out there. There's a lot of competition between the private equity firms. So the valuations are pretty rich. And I think, you know, when you file, you put yourself on the radar. You know, other private equity funds find out who you are. I'm not sure that answers your question or not. I think there's a lot of value to running the process and making sure that you are seen by as many possible buyers as you can. You take any company in any condition, and the thing that drives the valuation the most, all other things being equal, is having two or more bidders. The first company I was a part of, the initial bid was $40 million. We sold it for 110. It was only because there were multiple bidders that ran the price up. Yeah, so I don't know that answers your question, but some thoughts anyway.